In week 13 of World Religions, we'll explore dialogue between religious traditions and attitudes that people of one religious tradition may have towards other religions. If you remember, when we looked at atheism, we noticed that Ricky Gervais, in his comedic way, and on a more serious note, Sam Harris, assumed that people of faith think that members of the other religions are all going to hell or somehow going to be doomed, damned, toast, cooked. Um, Clearly, that's not the case. Clearly, there are people of faith who recognize that other religions have value and truth, maybe not to the same extent as their own, and who don't believe that people are damned just because they belong to another religion. I mean, it makes no sense. I mean, wouldn't it mean that Christians would have to think that the Old Testament figures like Moses and the prophets and Abraham are all going to hell because they're in Christian, and Mary, the mother of Jesus, and Saint Joseph? It makes no sense. Um, so it would be helpful to look at the more nuanced ways in which we can think about how one religion can view another and how dialogue is then possible. So first of all, there's exclusivism. That's the easiest to understand. And exclusivism is the view that those atheistic thinkers are talking about. The idea that people in religion A think people in religion B, C, D, and all the other religions are all going to hell, or are somehow all doomed because they're not members of the right club. That exists, definitely. It can be difficult to justify because a question arises as to what's the correct unit of analysis. If I'm a really conservative Catholic who thinks that you can't go to heaven unless you're like me, would that mean you have to be a really conservative Catholic in my little sect of Catholicism? What about other Catholics? Can they go? Or Christians? Or would it extend to all monotheists? Or all people? Where do you draw the line? Where is the right unit of analysis for the little cluster of those who can be saved? For some, honestly, it would be oneself, because you can't really be sure what other people believe. So maybe the only one who has the possibility of salvation is oneself, to be honest, with that view. Exclusivism. Where do you draw the line? Where is the boundary between the saved and the unsaved? Then there's inclusivism, which is the view that my own religious tradition is correct in its assertions. It has the right description of the sacred or of the God-world relationship. But other people outside my group can be saved because of what I believe. So if I believe all people can be saved through Christ, well, all people can be, even if they've never heard of Christ. So cavemen, Neolithic people, people on like uncontacted Amazon tribes, or people who for some reason have horrific experiences with churches and won't go near them, they can be saved because it's still true that all salvation happens through Christ, regardless of what they believed. They're saved through Christ, not through their beliefs about Christ or through their knowledge of Christ. They're saved through Christ. So this would be inclusivism. And one example of inclusivism would be the Christian theologian Karl Rahner saying that people can be anonymous Christians, that people who don't identify as Christian follow their conscience, and by doing that, they're following Christ, speaking in their conscience, and they can be saved. That's inclusivism. Then there is pluralism, the idea that all the religions are like a patchwork quilt, and God wants all of them because all of them articulate some bit of the truth, and that's why they all exist. They're all attempts to express the ultimately ineffable mystery. They're like the blind man with the elephant. Um, it's a poem about blind men who find an elephant, and some of them are fumbling around with the legs and think the elephant is like a tree. Some of them fumble with the tail and think it's like a snake. And they all have a piece of the truth, but none of them have the whole truth. That's pluralism. And of course, a challenge to that is what's included and what isn't included. If all the religions have a rightful place in the patchwork quilt, do religions based around human sacrifice, misogyny, homophobia, or the violent beliefs and practices, stoning, adultery, is all of that part of the patchwork quilt too? Or only the nice religions part of the patchwork quilt? So there are three ways that people of one faith might think about other religions: inclusivism, exclusivism, and pluralism. Then we look at scriptural reasoning. It's a way of going about interreligious dialogue. It's the idea that we shouldn't try to create a fake neutral space when we're dialoguing with people of another religion or another worldview, because this could include atheists and agnostics as well. We shouldn't pretend that we're abandoning our commitments and entering this neutral, secular, objective, non-committal space. First of all, it's impossible. It doesn't exist. If you're sincere about your religion, it's part of your worldview. It influences the way you see everything. So rather, we should approach interreligious dialogue by sticking to our guns, adhering to our beliefs, and discussing our sacred texts with people of other religions. So a group that's doing scriptural reasoning would typically be a group of Muslims and a group of Christians, and they would talk about a text from the Bible and a text from the Quran, and they may find overlap and commonality. But even if they don't, the fact they've done this, the fact they've had this respectful, constructive discussion, builds a relationship. That's important in itself. So it's not always about consensus. It can just be about mutual respect and learning about the perspective of the other, even though we're not persuaded by it always, certainly probably not converted by it. It's the conversation that matters. And yes, common ground can emerge, but we don't pretend to be neutral about it. We bring our commitments, we bring our sacred texts and have the dialogue. Lastly, this week, we're going to look at a movement called Unitarian Universalism. Unitarian Universalism comes from two movements that merged together. Even in the early forms of Christianity, there were Universalists, people who believed that in the end, everybody will be saved. Some argue St. Paul taught that. Not everyone is in agreement on that. But a clear case would be St. Origen of Alexandria in the 2nd century, who believed that in the end, hell will be emptied. Even the most stubborn sinner cannot hold out against the love of God. He believed even the devil and other demons would be freed from hell. So for him, hell wasn't eternal. God's love wins in the end. That's the Universalist belief. And Universalism continued through the centuries, and there were Universalists right up into the 19th and 20th century. And in the 19th century, Universalism, in its official form, merged with Unitarianism, which is another movement. Unitarians were Christians who did not believe in the Trinity, basically. They believed there was nothing to be gained by trying to quantify God, by trying to say that the ineffable mystery that goes beyond human words and concepts can be given a number. So it rejects the idea of the Trinity. In the 1960s, actually in the 19th century, these two movements joined together, Unitarian Universalism. And in the 60s, they ceased to identify as a Christian church. Many Christians are still members. It's compatible with Christianity in the view of many people, but it's not a Christian church in and of itself. It doesn't identify like that anymore. Its worship often involves using the texts from a plethora of world religions, poetry from humanistic sources. I mean, it could be anything from an Emily Dickinson poem in a Christian hymn to a meditation that's very Buddhist in style, to a reflection on a hadith from Islam. It'll blend them all together, maybe around one theme, and thinks that all of these religions have something to offer, and we can choose what's best from all of them. And they all support us on our journey. That's Unitarian Universalism. So there was quite a bit in this week in the sense of attitudes towards other religions, which would be inclusivism, exclusivism, and pluralism. Then this method of interreligious dialogue that's called scriptural reasoning, and the movement called Unitarian Universalism, or the UUs as they call themselves in a less tongue-twisting way, which is the idea that all of the religions can be represented in a community that searches together for the truth. It's eclectic. It takes what's best from lots of religious traditions. Maybe not all of them, maybe not from the cult of human sacrifice so much, but from all the major world religions, and maybe from indigenous religions too, and from philosophies that mightn't be considered religious per se, and puts them all together to see how they can aid us in our search. So the discussion post asks you to reflect on how scriptural reasoning as a form of dialogue, and how Unitarian Universalism, as this very inclusive search using all the different traditions, how that could meld, how that could work with your perspective on religion, whatever that is. I mean, it might be anything from being a really conservative Catholic to being a liberal Methodist, to being an agnostic, who knows, a Wiccan, whatever your perspective. That's what will make this really interesting. How would these fit with your perspective, whatever it is? And that's basically what the discussion post will be this week. And I can't wait to see what you have to say about scriptural reasoning and Unitarian Universalism. Thank you so much.